Welcome to the FarmED podcast. I'm Jonty Brunye, Head of Sustainable Farming and Food Systems, and I'm your host for today. Here at FarmED, our audience is everyone, our local community, farmers, growers, advisors, foodies, policymakers, students and researchers. We want to see everybody who eats or is curious about the future here on farm. We cover soil health, gut health and everything in between. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Lucy Williamson and daughter Jane. Lucy, a trained vet, is now an award-winning nutritionist. She uses an evidence-based approach to promoting diets that offer long-term health of ecosystems and humans. Jane has just finished her A-levels and is currently taking a gap year. She is passionate about sustainability, the planet and food. Danielle Semple is also here today. Danielle is FarmED's Sustainable Farming and Food intern, and she helps undertake various projects on the farm and has a specific interest in earthworms and soil. Thank you everyone for joining us. So Lucy, tell me a little bit about your journey from vet to nutritionist.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one, and I graduated as a vet back in 1991 and always loved using nutrition in animal health, was just fascinated by what we could do with it. And then when I stopped working to start my family, and I just became even much more interested in the influence of nutrition in our lives, and was fortunate in that I had a very supportive family around me and was able to go back to university 6 years ago and do a master's in nutrition at King's College. And it was a general nutrition degree, but while I was there, I became really much more fascinated by nutrition and human health. So I then decided I definitely wanted to move more into public health and preventative health, although I miss my vetting days. But so that's sort of what took me in that direction.
Wonderful, thank you. And Jane, introduce yourself. What have you been doing? What are you doing now?
So I'm a 19-year-old nature campaigner, environmentalist, a big fan of agroecology and all things soil health, human health, biodiversity, everything in between. And I've taken a gap year after leaving school just to, it's not really a typical gap year. It was hugely driven by my love of the environment and kind of desire to really pursue stuff that really matters, having left school being a bit frustrated about the curriculum not being kind of fully engaged with the really main issues that are going to concern my generation. So I wanted to take some time to actually teach myself a bit, and so I spent a lot of time volunteering on organic farms through the fantastic WOOF initiative, which stands for Working on Organic Farms, or I think something like that. So I'm currently on a farm up in Scotland, just north of Inverness at the moment, but I've spent time on 3 others so far with a big variety of different processes going on, different schemes and ideas and initiatives, all with the aim of regenerating the soil and regenerating the health of the animals that they're working with, as well as the humans that are involved. And it's been an amazing process. I've learned a huge amount, and it's really inspired other work that I've been doing as well this year with UK Youth for Nature. We did a fantastic project to highlight biodiversity loss as well, which all links into food security and what we're doing to our planet. So it's been a great year so far, and I'm really excited to keep going and see what I can learn next.
Amazing. Both of you just make me smile so much. I've been following you on social media, and the two of you are force for nature, and absolutely amazing. Can you tell me a little bit about the gut microbiome and that nutritional profile, that whole thing? What got you interested in that in the first place?
I think that's Mum's go first.
Well, I was lucky in that where I did my master's at King's, that's the forefront of the research for the microbiome, the gut microbiome. So that just, I remember the day I had that first lecture, and I just thought, wow, this is amazing. And I particularly love it because there is a really obvious link back to the land. And so for me, with my vet background, it's been a way to keep that side of my interest going. And I think, this area of connecting our health back to the nutrient density of the food and how it's farmed is so important. And for our microbiome, our gut microbes to really thrive, we need to feed them really nutrient dense, good quality food. And you know, the simple fact is that they are impacted by how we eat, how we choose to live, and yet they're absolutely vital for our long-term health. And we can all, you know, easily nurture them if only everybody knew how to do that, and we weren't surrounded by a food system that challenges that really. But yeah, it's, I mean, just to put it into perspective, so man's been on the planet for 3 million years, and our microbes, those bacteria that we're talking about, have existed on the planet for about 10 billion years. So they were here long before we were, and we've evolved together, and therefore we need them and we need each other. And you know, Jane often talks about it being part of a sort of a benefit to our survival if we really nurture our microbes.
Yes, what really fascinated me the most was just how dependent we are on our gut microbiome for so many physiological processes, not least our immune system. And the immune cells interact with the microbes at this interface in our large intestine and basically ensure that the homeostasis that we need for optimum health kind of perpetuates, which is really, really cool when you think about it, because ecosystems externally are hugely, or should be hugely, biodiverse, which perpetuates this kind of equilibrium and continued health of the ecosystem. And when you think about that on a micro level, what's going on inside us and the human body that results is almost that stable ecosystem, if you think of us as an ecosystem ourselves, just on a much smaller level.
We are an ecosystem,
really
we're
striking.
part of an ecosystem, absolutely.
Yeah.
So can I go back one step, Jane, if I may? Tell
me,
what inspired you at school or whatever, what age were you when something really clicked? Did it come from mum, or was it something in a biology lesson, or something you heard or read, or where did your passion come from?
So we did this, the project I'm talking about is called an extended project qualification. And I did that in year 12 when I was 17, actually during the summer of the first lockdown in 2020. But I think I do definitely owe it to my biology teacher for really inspiring me about how the immune system works. That was something that really sparked an interest, because right from the get-go, I could see that there was something really, really interesting happening there, where it was this kind of push-pull thing where the immune cells need to know what's harmless and what's not. And I just wanted to know more about how they did that. And it makes so much sense that the only reason that they've learned that is through interacting with microbes in the environment. And if those microbes aren't there or in the right proportions, then a lot of problems can result, which you could attribute a lot of today's health problems to.
Yeah, so, I mean, full marks to your teacher for stimulating that in you.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that, John T? So I remember the moment when Jane showed us as a family that she was definitely going to go down this biology nature route. So we were on holiday in Devon, and Jane was about 3.5. And she brought home snails that she'd collected along the route of the walk and continued to make a farm out of them when we got back to the cottage. And I remember thinking, I think we've got a nature lover here.
That connection was made.
No, I remember it.
Yeah. And I'm sure you ate lots of soil and things as well to get your gut biome working at an early age. Yeah, good.
Absolutely.
Cool. Just moving on a little bit about farming. FarmED, we're here really to promote agroecology and regenerative agriculture. What role do you think intensive agriculture, and I know that's hard to define, but what role does intensive agriculture play on human health, its relationship with the gut biome, good and bad? Any thoughts?
So, well, if I just start off, I think I always like to keep these conversations positive, and sometimes it is really hard to explain it. And I guess first just to say, we all know that farmers have only farmed in the way they've been encouraged to farm. But what we've ended up with is with this intensive farming system, which produces commodity produce really, rather than actual whole food. Or at least that's what it's been encouraged to produce the last few decades. And that those kind of foods, those kind of products out of that intensive farming system are very much driving poor health. through more processed foods. They drive these processes in the body which tend to cause inflammation, which are at the root of many chronic diseases. So if you sort of flip that and think about regenerative farming practices then, where you're learning from nature, very much aligned with nature in how you're farming, and those systems tend to produce whole, real foods that we recognise. What we see on the plate is we still recognise it as the food that it came out of the ground as, or whether it's dairy or beef, but it's minimally processed, and also very little, if any, use of chemicals which are sterilising the soil effectively, and those products of regenerative farming then are producing nutrient-rich food, which is really driving the whole gut microbiome and driving health. I mean, our microbiome has been, the research is phenomenal. It's the most rapidly growing area in medical research at the moment, and we know we can connect it with everything from allergy to cancer prevention to cholesterol, immune system, as Jane says. So it's an enormous thing. So yeah, the issue certainly with our intensive farming systems, producing this sort of energy-rich but nutrient-poor food is certainly key.
And what are the key factors in that, though? I mean, we talk about this a lot, and I'm still not convinced. Where's the evidence? Is it soil? Is it the crops we grow? Is it the genetics of the crops we grow? Is it the processing? Which bit of the food chain is the most damaging or the most negative?
Well, I don't know that we know the answer, and a lot of it, of course, this is a very new area that we're talking about, so we're really waiting for a lot of this research to be done. But certainly we know, as far as the microbiome goes, that the processing, so whether you're adding emulsifiers, for example, they really, we have the research to show that really upsets it. It has the same effect on your biome as it does on food. It causes this difficult gel substance, and your microbes can't survive very well in that. So, so that's one concern. But also, what I'm excited to learn more about and keep up with, and I know you're doing quite a bit here, or hope to, as far as understanding how the health of the soil translates into nutrient-rich food, and that's the missing link really at the moment. I think that's, logic tells us that if we're not using chemicals and we're producing food that is rich because of this uncanny similarity of the microbes in the soil, and I think Jane would probably love to tell you what she knows about that, but how the plants then are so much better to absorb nutrients from healthy soil, and it's the same in our own microbiome. Our microbes do the thing for us that we can't do, which is to absorb nutrients. So so I think we're really waiting for a lot of research, but there's so much logic there. It's frustrating at the moment when you're talking about evidence-based science. It's difficult.
There's some, but there's still gaps.
Jane, we share a common friend, which is the soil. So I was wondering what you've learned in your process of writing your EPQ about soil that relates directly to microbes in our guts and also in the soil.
Yeah, so it's the soil is this hugely underappreciated ecosystem in itself, I think. And what I've been realizing throughout research and school and my learning this year is that within an ecosystem, whatever you define that as, there are always other processes and other ecosystems within that. So actually the soil itself is an ecosystem, but then it gives rise to the producers that grow from the soil, and then the herbivores that feed on those, and then the next levels in the food chain that ascend from there. So it's this kind of entangled web, I suppose, of ecosystem leading to ecosystem, and it's all about diversity and balance and equilibrium, which arises from interactions between a myriad of different things. And even this morning, as I was had my hands in the soil, and I was thinking how what Mum was saying as well, about how we are so dependent on microbes to harness nutrients from our food that we can't. They're not intending to give us nutrients. They're just going about their daily business as they would do in their ecosystem. But it so happens that we can then harness the nutrients that they provide kind of collaterally as a result of us being able to live symbiotically with them. So in an ecosystem, I think I kind of came up with this concept of everyone getting their share, and how there's all these kind of interacting organisms and feeding off each other and feeding off the products of each other. And actually in the soil, that is exactly the same. It applies in exactly the same way as it does within our guts. It's just a different environment, but it's exactly the same concept. And that was what was the most striking through my research, actually, was how we need to kind of get rid of this definition of an ecosystem as like a rainforest or a desert or whatever. It's so much more about the principles. And we need to reimagine ourselves as part of an ecosystem and harbouring an ecosystem within us, rather than just sort of separate from them, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, can I add something else? So I think it's quite interesting that you keep bringing up the word equilibrium and kind of homeostasis. And what you're saying to me sounds like you're kind of that soil is the foundation of this ecosystem, and if there's a slight imbalance in that soil, that offsets the whole of the ecosystem. And you know, bringing it back to your essay and how that then affects our immune systems, that means that, you know, we're completely screwed from the get-go, if I'm allowed to say that.
Yeah, I think it's do you mean in a way like for like, or as an extension of the soil into our own health, like comparing, or
yeah,
you know?
So if soil is of a poor state of health, then that immediately means that we're kind of set at a disadvantage when the food is produced in that soil and we then eat it. We're just setting ourselves at a disadvantage.
Yeah, I think the main is kind of, I think an important differentiation is what we're doing to our soil in order to produce the food, and how those collateral impacts of the production impact our health, and then also how the food itself is then impacting our health, because I think they're slightly different. I mean, one is an extension of the other, but they're slightly different in that collateral impacts of the way we produce food have health impacts on so many different levels, whether that's earthworms or humans. Whereas I think the food that's produced itself is obviously just a human concern because of its different nutritional value. The main thing for me throughout my research and experience has been this realization of how dependent our physiology is on cells which aren't ours, which originate in the environment, which we've evolved to coexist with, and that's the equilibrium that Danielle was mentioning. So that was really striking, was that we have far more microbial cells within us than human cells, for one thing, and our internal microbiome is the most densely populated ecosystem on Earth when you look at it in numbers. So it's pretty mind-blowing, and that in itself should say something. But yes, I think it's the equilibrium, and actually then the disequilibrium that results from farming practices that reduce microbial biodiversity in the environment, which then mean that we're less exposed to biodiversity in our external environment, which then, when we're growing up, whatever, which then means that we have a less diverse range of microbes within us, which impacts our health because they're so intrinsic in our health.
Can you, Lucy and Jane, do you want to pinpoint where would we look for good evidence, or who's the pioneers in this body of work that we could read more about this?
So, I mean, I think from my point of view, my skill set is much more on the influence of the microbiome on human health.
Yeah.
And I follow Professor Tim Spector at King's College, who's puts out all sorts of really interesting podcasts. He, along with an Australian and American counterpart, have a company called Zoe, who you might have come across, but lots of the research has gone into, so that they're pooling all their research into that. And fantastic source of information to follow. And as far as the effects of the soil on our own microbiome, I think that is the new area that we're all dying to. I mean, I was talking to some researchers at Exeter University last week actually who are really keen to form some sort of a cooperative with regenerative farmers to start getting this pool of research that we need going, which is really exciting.
Yeah, that would be good. And what about Zach Bush's work in America,
Yes.
nutritional density, soil
Yes.
health link?
Yeah.
Tell us more about that one.
Well, I mean, he works with Tim Spector, and I mean, he's, again, you know, I would encourage people just to have a listen to his podcast. It's exactly the same as what we're talking about today, that this problem with the chemicals that we've used on the soil, as you well know, and in effect that's just sterilising our world, and that we have this theory that, as Jane said, you know, we're a superorganism, we are part of nature, as you've said, Jonty, and soil is a huge, or should be a huge pool of microorganisms, and we're all replenishing each other. So if we're using a lot of agrochemicals, you know, that's hugely upsetting the balance, and you know, there's obviously two sides to that story. What might the chemicals have done to our health, but also what's that doing to our microbes that we're very dependent on for good.
That's, I just wanted to pick up really quickly on that. The thing about using chemicals to kind of sort of enhance or maximize production of certain crops, and then, or certain elements of the ecosystem, and then sideline or remove others. Just quickly to add was that nature doesn't like accumulations of things, or monocultures of things, or densities of things that have kind of grown out of proportion because of the limiting factors that operate within ecosystems. And what I was saying earlier about everyone getting their share is kind of true here as well, because in a farming system where you're kind of intensively producing a crop or rearing an animal, obviously the diversity is so much less, and then you end up with these huge kind of accumulations of one thing, which are hugely which you don't see in nature. And then when you consider that in the context of how can we make a farm like an ecosystem, we need to return to a model that's that replicates an ecosystem to a much greater degree. So I think a lot of the disequilibrium that I've been talking about in the gut is also applicable in the external environment, where equilibrium is dependent on diversity and a huge wealth of different living things doing their thing and stopping each other from growing out of proportion. So a farming system, exactly like a farming system that rears one thing, is never going to work on its own. It's going to always need intensive inputs, which aren't sustainable in the long run.
And I think it's just really great timing just to say that the one key thing that's so important with your gut microbiome is the diversity of it. I think actually, just very quickly, a fantastic analogy for what you were just saying, Jane, is the difference between a sort of shop-bought, plastic-wrapped, sliced loaf of bread and a loaf of sourdough. Because the shop-bought is the yeast monoculture, industrialised, that one variety of yeast that's used to produce that loaf of bread can play havoc with our digestion because it's quite unnatural for us, whereas sourdough, you're using all the natural yeasts that are present in the grain, and you've got that lovely variety there, and it's much easier for us to digest it and absorb all the goodness from it. It's a nice little analogy.
Yeah, no, that's a classic one. And thinking about in the kitchen, we can blame farmers all day, and we shouldn't do that, about soil health, use of chemicals, and of course lots of the chemicals inputs that we do use, I say as a farmer, it's fed the world for the last 100 years.
Absolutely.
What about in the kitchen? Are we over clean? Are we feeding our children the right food? What responsibility are we going to take as consumers, as cooks, as chefs, as mums and dads?
Yeah, I mean, this is the huge problem, and what I'm really interested in as a nutritionist is making everything that we're talking about actually accessible to everybody and the people that need it the most. And so in the kitchen, for a start, you know, are you able to cook? Do you have the resources to cook? And I think we want to be thinking, when you're going back to that loaf of bread, you know, have a look at the label. Do you recognise half the ingredients on that? Because we only really want to be eating food that we would actually have in our own cupboard, in our own larder. And so, it is about getting back to basics and making that time in life to cook. And actually, you know, I roasted a chicken yesterday. I took it off the bone this morning, made it into stock. It makes several meals. It's but it's time, and that's a resource that people don't have.
Yeah. Okay.
It's very true. I think the huge challenge for consumers is actually the convenience and how easy it is to eat in a way that's not conducive to the health of the environment and you. Because cheap, overly processed food is so abundant and so easy, and bypasses the need to know how to cook, or the time needed to cook it, and the knowledge that's needed that we are losing, really. And I think, it's quite worrying. We need to kind of revalue the role of food in our lives, because ultimately food isn't just energy, it is the chemicals that then become your body. And if you put food in that context, and if you look at a field of crop and you think, well, that's going to actually become my body, you would think of it in a much different way to if you were just sort of mindlessly looking at a loaf of bread on the shelf and thinking, oh, that'll fuel me for the rest of the day, you know?
Yeah.
So
it's a problem.
I think it's there's
really
a big barrier in understanding how food actually builds your body once you've eaten it, and also in how easy it is to just mindlessly consume. It's not consumers' fault. It's the way that food is marketed as just a product of a supply chain, rather than kind of telling the story of the ecosystem that it's come from.
Okay.
Food is a process, not a product. We need to be also revaluing how much we're prepared to spend on food, because actually, with the cost of living crisis that we're currently facing, if supermarkets react, or if the popular opinion is to ask supermarkets to reduce prices even further, then we end up with this horrible downward spiral of farmers earning less and less per unit or whatever, and having to then produce more of those units in an even more intensive way. So we need to make food more affordable, but we also need to reassess how much we're prepared to spend on food, and like how much of whatever we're buying we're eating. Because actually, talking to people here on this farm, they were saying that since they've been eating organically and in a more mindful way, they're finding they're eating less because they value the food more, because they've either grown it themselves, or they've seen how it's been reared, or they know the true cost of it, and so they're not going to overconsume it or waste it. And that is a really important transition that's needed as well.
I think that concept of true cost of food is a crucial one.
Yeah.
We are going to get change. Yeah. Cool.
And I think it's really important, just mentioning that true cost accounting of food, that whole conversation around meats and how much meat we should be eating, what kind of meat we should be eating, like where it comes from. Lucy, I know you're particularly interested in dairy and the role it plays in both our human systems and the environmental systems. So can you explain to us why and where our dairy products come from, and why that's important to the health of us humans and the environment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm particularly keen on shouting out for dairy, because it's it's just such a vital food for our own health, and because of a lot of our dairy farming in the UK is intensively farmed. It's obviously been villainised over the years, and actually that is a real issue for our health. I mean, we can absorb calcium from dairy better than any other food. So even when people think that, I'm going to make sure I eat lots of leafy greens, unfortunately a lot of those nutrients like calcium are really locked in the vegetables, and it's actually quite hard for us to absorb them, whereas dairy just provides this fantastic source. And there's many other nutrients in dairy. Calcium's the obvious one, but fantastic protein nutrients like iodine, which you never hear about, but actually are really, really important for pregnancy and healthy babies, and we're very low in iodine in our soils in the UK, but actually still milk does provide a very good source of it. So there are many wonderful things about milk, and I think it's always really important to talk about dairy milk and how different it is as a food to a plant drink, because you just can't compare them. And if we think about a dairy farm where they are farming regeneratively, and actually this is teaching Granny to suck eggs, Jonty, but those grazing animals are absolutely vital in the ecosystem that Jane's been talking about. And I think, again, in the media, we just don't hear these stories. We don't hear that you need to have cows to be aerating the soil with their cloven hooves, or trampling in the dry matter back into the soil, or fertilising it naturally with their cow pats. It's the very fact that cows have their own gut health and have their own microbes that re-fertilises the soil very naturally and keeps it healthy, and then that the soil is good for growing very healthy crops. So the animals are all part of the ecosystem, and at the same time they are producing a very healthy food for us. And I'm also particularly interested in the health of children, and obviously dairy is a wonderful food for that.
Shout out for dairying and dairy farmers.
Absolutely.
So integration of livestock is key in a regenerative system. Milk, I get. Tell me a little bit more about the meat debate and the nutritional benefits of meat. Can we live without it?
Well, I would say no. As a nutritionist, again, the iron that's in beef and other meat is immediately absorbable, where it's freely available to us, whereas that iron in plants is locked away. You have to break it down some way to be able to absorb it. So from that point of view alone, beef is very important. But what we know from so far from the research, beef from pasture-fed systems, whether it's organic or regenerative or what we want to call it, it has a far higher amount of unsaturated fats in it, presumably coming from the diverse range of the herbs and the legumes and the grasses that those cattle are eating. So the fact that its fat profile is so much healthier than meat from an intensively farmed system, and of course the animals then are contributing to the health of the soil, which then makes it a much more efficient carbon sink. I mean, it's just a wonderful circle, really.
So produced sustainably, beef, lamb, milk can be very good for us and can be good for the planet. That's something really important to remember.
Lucy, thanks for your input on the cows. So back to Jane and your essay, I really liked how you spoke about the bees and the role that they play in pollinating, and that directly relates to our gut health and our microbes. So I'm a big advocate for earthworms and how we can tell the story of soil through earthworms. But what do you think? How do you think we can tell the story of honeybees or pollinators in the importance of biodiversity protection and regenerative farming?
Yeah, so it's a really cool one. There's two elements to it. One is the obvious role of honeybees in perpetuating the producer population and ecosystem, which is the plants that photosynthesize, and perpetuating that stable first level of the food chain, which is obviously vital in every respect, because without a producer to convert sunlight into chemical energy, we would be nowhere. So that's the first role. And then the second one, which is where my essay kind of picked up, was that a honeybee in its colony has a role in maintaining the biodiversity of the external environment, like I said. And you can compare that role of the honeybee to an immune cell within us, maintaining internal biodiversity of our gut microbiome. And I loved this comparison because for so many people, I think the concept of an ecosystem in your stomach, in your large intestine, is very odd, understandably. So if you could almost rationalize what's going on inside you by seeing it outside of you in the collapse of honeybee populations, that might be a way of helping people to understand what can be going on inside if the biodiversity within you isn't where it should be. So the honeybee population interacting with the external environment is basically a metaphor for the immune cells interacting with the microbes inside us. So there's two elements, yes.
Yeah, I like it.
Amazing.
Cool.
Jane, you mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic in your essay.
Yes.
How does that link? The spread of viruses, biodiversity loss. What's the link there?
So obviously it's a hugely contentious issue where COVID-19 emerged from, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest, and actually the WWF have published a really interesting report on this, a lot of evidence to suggest that it's our kind of encroachment on and disrespect of ecosystems through our lifestyle that potentially caused that jump from the species that COVID originated in to us. It's a zoonotic virus, which means that it's come from a species that's not Homo sapiens, and it's opportunistically jumped across to us. And that WWF report suggests that there's a really strong correlation between the number of viruses known to infect humans from other species and the amount of biodiversity loss going on around the world. And both of those are strong upward trajectories. So the really interesting thing for me is that, like I've been saying, the biodiversity loss is also hugely significant for our immune health, and actually inflammation or the dysbiosis that happens as a result of poor, or I suppose kind of compromised microbial biodiversity inside us, that immune disruption then leaves us less well equipped to deal with the increasing emergence of viruses.
Okay.
So not only, if that makes sense, the kind of double-edged sword, we're not only weaker, but we're also more likely to be exposed to them.
Yeah.
So biodiversity is shown to be vital in reducing the emergence of these things, and also buffering our
No,
my words, honestly.
It's complex, but it's now starting to make sense. Amazing. Yeah. Could I ask about the role of antibiotics in this for livestock and humans?
Yeah, so I think two ways to look at it. So antibiotics are obviously one of the most fantastic inventions in many ways in medicine, and there are certainly times when we absolutely need them, but unfortunately, because we're using so many of them, they are just another way that we're sterilising our world. So, for example, what I see in my work as a nutritionist sometimes is that I'll be talking to somebody who's an adult and who's suddenly got this allergy that they never had before, and why has that happened? And then it might turn out that they've had major surgery and perhaps been on antibiotics for a month afterwards, which just knocks out all your microbes.
Yeah.
So when you're on antibiotics, if you have to be on them, it's really, really important to eat in a way that really nurtures your microbiome. So certainly a problem as far as in humans, antibiotics, and then in animals, it's a very similar situation. Cattle on antibiotics knocking out their really vital bacteria, and if it wasn't for those bacteria, they would struggle to convert grass into milk. And just within the whole ecosystem, the effect of antibiotics in reducing the really important microbes in our world that we need for our health. Because I think maybe at this point it's a good time to say that when we were at school, we all remember those agar plates.
Yes.
And the teacher would always say, and Jane's got much more recent experience of this, that they would always use that line, don't bother about those, they're just commensals. What we're looking for is the nasty ones.
Right.
But of course it's those commensals, those ones that are just ordinary, that we're now discovering are so important.
Okay.
Those are the microbes that we're talking about, that we have inside us, that we have in the soil, and we need to start realising that these bacteria are our friend and really respect them, and so we have to certainly be very careful with the use of antibiotics.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure we've all had to take antibiotics in our lives, and we don't all eat very well. What are the easiest fixes? What can we do today, tomorrow, to improve our diets?
Yeah, so I mean, the best news is that we can all improve our gut bacteria within 2 days of changing the way we eat. And it's not a massive change, but the key things are variety of fibre. And when we say fibre, we mean fruit and veg and nuts and seeds and grains. So fibre, really, really key, which is why we hear so much about this plant-based diet, which is good.
Yeah.
But what that actually means is that about 65 to 70%, or 2/3 of your plate, if you like, is great to be made up of plants. But that other third, it's really crucial to remember that the animal proteins, whether it's dairy or meat or eggs or fish, also providing really nutrient-dense food, and actually our microbiome needs that nutrient-dense food, sort of nice quality food, minimally processed.
Yeah.
So we're talking about just kind of getting back to basics really, and eating food in its most natural form.
Mm-hmm.
So it's nutrient dense, it's fibre, and the third thing is fermented foods.
Yeah.
And really what we know now from the research is that if you can have a little bit of fermented food, maybe every day, every other day, that really provides us with natural probiotics, so natural bacteria which tops up our own.
Yeah.
So the fibre in the food is actually feeding our own microbes, and they feed off it, and they give us all sorts of beneficial chemicals from the way they digest that food. But the fermented foods are actually giving us more bacteria to top up our levels.
And does supplementation help? I see those tablets, some cheap, some expensive on the supermarket shelf. Are they worth trying?
So do you mean probiotic supplementation? Yeah, so all we really know is that there has been some really fairly solid research done on this, which seems to show that if a probiotic is in a liquid form, it's much more likely to work because the bacteria are alive. So if it's a dried product for a start, they're inactive. So, you know, that tells you something about it. But what I know from the work I do in researching naturally probiotic foods, so we're thinking things like yogurt, cheese, you know, the more mature the cheese, the more bacteria it has in it.
Mature cheese, that's good.
Yeah, so it's all good, it's all good. Kefir, the fermented milk drink, things like sauerkraut, these naturally fermented vegetable products. All those types of food, if you're actually taking in the bacteria in a natural food, then the food actually protects the bacteria as it goes through your digestive system. Right. So I would say as a nutritionist, far better just to eat it. Eat the food.
Diverse range of wholesome food, absolutely.
Exactly, that's the short version.
Perfect, good. So thinking about the future, Jane, what's next for you?
So in the short term, I'm about to head off on my bike to explore the possibilities that ecological restoration and rewilding, in inverted commas, hold for Scotland. Okay. So I'm connecting lots of different rewilding projects, ecological restoration sites on my bike to talk with people, see it all for myself, and kind of envision how Scotland could look if it was rewilded on a kind of societal level by restoring the strength of local communities as well as on an ecological level, which is fairly obvious. But I'm really excited to also be part of the FarmED's Youth Summit, yet to be named, in September. Yeah. I'm really, really excited to be...
generation, that's what we're now calling it. Yeah, look out.
Oh, really? Yeah. Is that cool? Okay, so yes, there's going to be a fantastic celebration of everything we've been talking about and more, and that's going to be a wonderful event. And I'm heading to university in September to study biology, so that will be the next step in my kind of more scientific journey.
Wow.
Yeah.
You are amazing. I wish I knew what you knew when I was 19.
Oh, well, I mean, it's... I think I always feel this kind of burden of responsibility to kind of... I mean, I've started learning, but I've got so much more to learn. I want to share it, but I also want to learn more, and it's difficult to know how much to keep pursuing it rather than, you know, it gets too much sometimes. Yeah. But
you're on an amazing...
The passion is the important part, and I've got that.
You've got that passion, you've got that knowledge, you're on an amazing journey, and you can't do it all. Don't forget that. Don't be too overwhelmed. We're all here working at it as well. Yeah, you're not on your own. Yeah. And Lucy, what's next for you?
So, well, a lot of the work I do as a nutritionist is working with food producers, particularly those that are farming more sort of climate-friendly systems, and they tend to be slightly smaller setups, and I help them to really understand the health benefits of their produce and help them to communicate it and market it, and I love doing that, and I'm hoping to really grow that part of my work. And I mentioned earlier that what's really important to me is to try and reach out so that, you know, this isn't just those of us that are fortunate enough to live near a farm shop and can go and buy this nice food that we're talking about, but to find ways, as I know you are here at Real FarmED, to find ways of making this work on a bigger scale. And so initially, I'm hoping in the next year to produce either a very short film or some sort of resource that is a free resource, and it goes to communities, whether it's into churches or schools or waiting rooms in hospitals or the NHS or whatever, and it's just trying to show that link between how our food is grown and easy ways to use natural food, easy ways to incorporate it into your cooking at home, that it doesn't have to be expensive. This is the thing, you know, we're not talking costly food here. Yeah. So that's a project that's really dear to my heart, and I'm looking for collaborators to really take that forward.
I'm sure we can help you with that one.
That would be very exciting. And then during COVID, I wrote a series of workshops on gut health, and always looking for more venues to run those now that we're back in person, which is really exciting. So
amazing. And how do people find you?
So my website, lwnutrition.co.uk, or email me at info.lwnutrition.co.uk, or the usual Instagram at Lucy Williamson Nutrition, which is also Facebook and Twitter as well. So wonderful. Whichever way you can find me, please do.
Great. Check Lucy out, listeners. It is wonderful. And Jane, more power to you. We'll see you again at the Youth Summit of the Emergent Generation at the end of the year.
Can't wait. Thank you so much.
Again at FarmED, and we'll do more together, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person. I'm 600 miles away at the moment.
Enjoy Scotland and your gap year. That's important.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for listening to the FarmED podcast. I'm Jonty Brunye, Head of Sustainable Farming and Food Systems. FarmED aims to be at the heart of local, regional and global agroecological transition. Our mission is to provide learning spaces and events that inspire, educate and connect people to build sustainable farming and food systems that nourish people and regenerate the planet. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. If you are passionate about regenerative agriculture, farming with nature and great food, then join us on the journey. It's time to make a difference.